Keto diet and epilepsy. Let's take a little look at epilepsy and how the keto diet actually got started. Most people probably don't know that the keto diet originally was a treatment for epilepsy, especially in kids, and it had a fantastic success rate. It was the majority, in the 90% range, got complete or almost complete resolution of their symptoms. And that was the case until they developed drugs, and then they said, oh, you don't have to keep eating all this fat, we've got a simple pill and then you can eat whatever you want. Now, depending on your philosophy, I don't think that's a great idea because there's tons and tons of side effects with drugs, and if you keep eating all that sugar, then you're creating other ill health effects, as you well know. But let's just take a quick look at what epilepsy is. So epilepsy is a spontaneous action potential. It's a spontaneous, uncontrolled discharge of energy and signals from a cell. So the brain signals with electricity, and it's supposed to do that in a controlled fashion. So we have something called a resting membrane potential. That's the difference, that's the line down here, that the voltage of the membrane is being pushed down so that it's stabilized. So it's harder for it to discharge. It's like a spring. You load it up and you keep it far away from the place where it discharges. So then when the brain wants to send a signal, then it creates a chain of events where it slowly increases the potential until it reaches a threshold, and then everything happens all at once. It's a sudden action called an action potential, and that starts a propagation of a wave that becomes a brain signal. And then the brain slowly after this, it's slowly in relation to how quickly it happens, but it still happens. The reset still happens in milliseconds. And then the brain brings it down below threshold and it pushes it down toward the resting membrane potential so that it's stable until next time it's supposed to fire off. So there are different things that can affect this resting membrane potential, and if it starts creeping up toward that point of spontaneous discharge, then we have an unstable membrane. And that's what happens in epilepsy when cells start firing uncontrollably and randomly. So the way that cells talk to each other is through synapses. And when they do that, they either increase or decrease the resting membrane potential. So this cell over here has a synapse and it sends a signal to increase the resting membrane potential, meaning it's bringing it closer to threshold, and it does that by, let's say, 5 millivolts. But at the same time, this cell over here sends an inhibitory signal. It pushes the potential further down by minus 10 millivolts, so the net effect is a minus 5. So even though there's two cells, one is bringing it, trying to make it fire, and one is trying to make it stop, the net effect is that this cell is stabilized and brought down. So of course, in the brain, there's 100 billion brain cells, and each brain cell makes on average 5 to 10,000 connections. So the complexity of how all these networks are interacting and firing and stabilizing and turning off is just immense. When everything is working, the brain does this on purpose, but there's a number of factors that can affect this and that can destabilize these membranes. So one is hereditary. Some people have defects. Another one is trauma. If you've had concussions or head trauma and you've sort of damaged some of the cells that might be inhibitory, then you can have a predisposition for a lesser membrane potential. Minerals can be very, very important because the way that the membranes fire is through the influx and outflux by transporting minerals, metal ions like sodium, potassium, and calcium across this membrane. Magnesium also is important. Magnesium is calming to people because it has a stabilizing effect on this membrane. And finally, the reason we're bringing this up is that sugar can have a tremendous destabilizing effect on this membrane. And there's a lot of different ideas on why ketosis is so beneficial for the brain and so forth, but if we just look at the very, very most basic observation, that it reversed the symptoms of the majority of epileptic kids. So epilepsy is instability of cell membranes. If you cut out the sugar, the symptoms go away, so that means the stability of the brain increases. That alone should be enough of an argument to eat a low-carb diet. And we also know that a high average glucose and a high A1C produces a faster brain degeneration. Your brain shrinks a little bit more year by year the higher your blood sugar is. So there's a lot of different observations to support that. One of the most common misconceptions about the brain is people say you have to have carbohydrates because the brain only runs on fuel, they say. And that's not true. It's almost true because the brain is more restricted on fuel than other body cells, like your heart and your muscles. They can run on a variety of different fuels. They can break down proteins into glucose. They love fat. The heart runs primarily on fat for energy. The brain can't use fat, but it uses glucose and ketones. And some people say that the people in favor of or opposed to ketosis, in favor of high carb, they say that you have to have carbs because the brain only runs on that, and the brain will always burn that first, so that's why it prefers glucose. And you could turn that around and say, well, the glucose is dangerous for the brain, so that's why it burns it first, because glucose in diabetics, high blood sugar, will put you in a coma. Low blood sugar will put you in a coma. Stable blood sugar promotes health and promotes brain function, and that's the main thing that ketosis does for the brain. It stabilizes blood sugar. It puts it at a very, very stable level. It hardly varies at all. And once we cut the carbs enough, once we cut them back far enough, then the brain can run about 75% on ketones and 25% on glucose. So when we cut the carbs back far enough, when we cut them low enough, then the body will learn to burn fat better. It will make ketones, and ketones become the backup fuel for the brain, and it can use as much as 75% of the fuel from ketones. So when people say we have to eat carbohydrates because the brain needs it, that's a very, very small portion. You don't need a whole lot of glucose, and you don't have to worry about it because if you eat enough vegetables, you're going to get a few grams of carbs every day regardless, so you're going to get plenty of glucose for the brain to supply the last 25% of what the brain needs. And when you cut carbs down, you're not threatening your blood sugar level. Okay? Yes, the brain needs some glucose, but you can never cut back far enough because the body has other ways of restoring blood sugar. And the best way to keep it really, really stable, the way the brain loves it, is to get into ketosis and make some ketones for the brain. So like I said, way back, the ketogenic diet started as a treatment for epilepsy in children. And back then, they didn't know a whole lot about nutrition. They didn't understand ketosis very well. They just knew that if you cut the carbs way back, try to get them down to zero, then and increase the fats, then you could reverse epilepsy. But they didn't understand necessarily a whole lot about the quality of fats. They didn't understand much maybe about whole food nutrition. And they didn't understand that you could eat lots and lots of vegetables and you could use tools like intermittent fasting, which is perfectly fine even in kids, because if you stabilize blood sugar, then you don't need to eat like a hummingbird. You don't need to top off your blood sugar every couple of hours, because your body learns to balance out the energy supply over the 24 hours. So if you eat a couple of times a day, that's plenty. With intermittent fasting and with vegetables and with whole food, then you can turn that into a very, very healthy lifestyle. And that was some of the arguments way back, and that's why it fell out of favor, because people, the kids got tired of the diet because it was really bland and they were almost chewing on butter sticks, basically. And then drugs came around and they said, look, we've got the pill, now you can eat whatever you want. So that's why it fell out of favor and people sort of forgot about it, until we had this epidemic of insulin resistance and diabetes and obesity, and now it became the primary tool for weight loss and insulin resistance. So the point, though, is stabilizing blood sugar doesn't just reduce insulin resistance and obesity. It's also good for the brain, it is good for your health, and it is good for every organ in the body if you do it right. Please share this video with as many people as you can. Leave your comments and questions below. If you have experience with this, please share so we can hear some success stories. Again, thanks for watching.